So our Robert, the Wellington, had a very active service. In fact, it covered 14 missions in its first year. It had gone into service and been created here at Brooklands in September 1939 and went on 14 operational sorties, which at the time, within the first year, was quite an achievement for a bomber of its type. The crews had changed during the course of that, and after as many missions, the aircraft was eventually reallocated to an operational training unit, or OTU. This one in particular was number 20 OTU, and it was based at Loch in Scotland, near the Moray Firth. The reason it was transferred was as an OTU, it could then use the skills and knowledge of the crews that were available to teach new navigators how to navigate. And the reason that it was Lossiemouth is there was considerable challenge when you consider the terrain associated with that part of Scotland. The other thing that happened with the aircraft, it was modified further, so it then had dual controls. Normally from an operational aircraft, it would just have one control where one pilot would seat. But in the case of an OTU, you would be training other pilots, so there was additional co-pilot on board the aircraft to ensure that they could rotate the tasks during the training process. So here we are. We've talked about being in a training unit, or OTU, on the particular day, which is New Year's Eve 1940. The aircraft is operating out of Lossiemouth, and it's flying around the Scottish Highlands. And at one stage, it goes through a considerable snowstorm. They decide to lose height to get out of the snowstorm, but in some ways the damage is done, and the starboard engine starts to ice up and fail. The reaction of the crew was to then lower the height of the aircraft to see if they could recover the engine power, but they weren't able to. And not only that, the port engine was also being exposed to these very low temperatures. The aircraft itself had 4 training navigators on board, and it resulted in the aircraft having to be abandoned. The captain gave the instruction, and the 4 navigators were pushed out the front of the aircraft and experienced their very first parachute jump from a live aircraft by bailing out of the aircraft at this stage. The tail gunner was also asked to make his way out, as was the wireless operator, and they all did so. This left the co-pilot and the main pilot on board the plane, and they attempted to bring it in to find somewhere to land. As they were going down towards the cloud level, they were surrounded by the highlands and the snowy peaks, and it didn't look very good. But then a sudden break in the cloud allowed them to take a glimpse, and they saw that Loch Ness was beneath them. Effectively 23 miles of runway if they chose to ditch the aircraft, which they did. They brought the aircraft in. The crews had all since gone. This left just 2 of them on board, and they brought the aircraft in not far away from Urquhart, and it came in, ditched, and came to a halt. The crew then stripped themselves off the bomber gear that they were wearing to keep them warm, to drop out of the windows on the side of the cockpit and into a very cold Loch Ness. They proceeded to swim then towards the top of the wings, where there are compartments in the engine nacelles, and they were able to pull out a life raft. They used the life raft to get themselves to the shore, and by this time there was a small welcoming committee of people who had heard it come down in the loch and were there to help pull them out of the dinghy and the cold water. Their immediate thoughts, of course, were for the crew who had bailed out, and so they managed to rally together a number of cars, and they set off into the glens to find the crew members that had got out. They did have some success in this manner, but unfortunately they couldn't find John Fensham, who was the tail gunner, and sadly it would appear that during the course of exiting his turret, his parachute failed, either by tangling in the subframe of the aircraft, or it just wasn't deployed properly. And sadly, John Fensham, who was just 20, fell to his death. Other members of the crew did, however, make a successful landing. One of them tells a great story, in fact. Lupton landed in a farm, and a Scottish farmer rounded him up, complete with pitchfork, unsure who he was. And he escorted him to the cottage, whereupon Lupton was able to confirm that he was a genuine member of the RAF. He was then taken to the local headquarters, and they were having their hogmanay, or their celebration of New Year's. And Lupton, who commented afterwards that he was forced, because he was hungry, to eat haggis. And haggis, to this day, he said, repulsed him. And it brought back the memories of the unfortunate incident of having to bail out. As I said earlier, none of these young navigators had received any parachute training. This was their first. The aircraft itself was then lost to history. Although it had safely landed, because of the canvas skin, it let water in and sank. And it became part of the myth of the Loch, that people would come up as a tourist and say, there's a monster in the Loch, and there's also a bomber. But it got lost to history. And that was until 1975, when some Americans came over with the new technology of being able to use sonar to find items beneath the water. And their hunt was actually for the Loch Ness monster and not a Wellington. And after several days of passing the sonar device as a towable array up and down Loch Ness, they came across what they at first thought was a Catalina. However, it turned out to be our Robert, and it was the missing Wellington. As I say, when an aircraft goes down in a loch, there are ripples and then it's gone, and there is no living memory of where. This actually allowed them to mark the site of where the Wellington was. Later on, the Royal Navy sent some divers to the site a few years later, and they were from HMS Vernon. And they had some of the diving capabilities that aren't really available to civilians. The aircraft was resting at about 120 foot down, which is just on the border of where you could dive yourself, but you needed other skills, particularly all the right gear to wear. And so they went down and they marked the site, and they were able to wipe along the canvas, and there very clearly was N2980, the serial number of the aircraft, clearly visible after being down there for 35 years. This then led to a confirmation of the aircraft and its status, and a charity was formed to raise the aircraft and put it in for restoration or display. Fortunately, the money that was raised was sufficient, and they were able to appoint a company called Ocean Engineering, who previous knowledge had been to work on North Sea oil rigs at great depth. They brought automation to it with robotics and key skilled people about marking and maneuvering things that might be fragile in the depths of the ocean. And as such, they were able to attach buoyancy devices to the Wellington, and this allowed them to inflate it and bring it slowly to the surface. It took 2 attempts at doing this, and during the course of that, it eventually did come to the surface and broke water. The positive news about it, that one of the original pilots, squadron leader Paul Harris, and his son Tim, were present when the aircraft he had once flown came to the surface. The process of lifting the aircraft was therefore, after that point, pretty straightforward. She had considerable damage associated with the impact of the landing, and also there had been various people who had sought to salvage parts as souvenirs, and that arguably had created more damage to the aircraft than it actually had incurred in the forced landing. The aircraft then was taken control of by British Aerospace, and they brought it and arranged for it to be brought here down to Brooklands, and it was put in the hangar in which it was originally commissioned. And the team that were there gathered round her, and they slowly but surely cleaned all the structure out and were able to reconstruct the finish of the aircraft, including how the skin would have looked and the markings. The reconstruction is partial for a genuine reason. First of all, to show the geodetic structure and the conditions in which these crews operated, which was in a very confined space. The other thing is that most people's perception of war aircraft, particularly Second World War, was that they were metal planes, but in fact our Robert had a coating of canvas. And this made people, when they first came here to see it, astounded that the enduring capability of the Wellington bomber was such that it was very hard to knock out of the sky, and that the canvas was quickly repaired. The crews of these planes came to love being on the Wimpy, as they called it, and as such, they didn't hesitate in flying with her again, even after this incident. Out of the crews that were on board during this, only 2 of them survived the war. The crews were reappointed once their training was finished, and then they found themselves in other bombers, and sadly they lost their life during the conflict. Only 2 people went on to then survive after the war and continue their RAF careers.